The town of Plains lies in the southwestern corner of America's fourth state, Georgia. It's in a region of flat or gently rolling landscapes, covered by forests or cultivated fields, and peppered with numerous other tiny towns. Plains and those numerous other tiny towns are the kind of places journalists lazily refer to as sleepy, because there doesn't appear to be that much going on. Traffic is sparse. Sidewalks are empty. Unless a big truck rolls through or someone cranks up a lawnmower, nature's sounds are the background noise of daily life. So why do so many of us know of Plains who haven't heard of Cordele, or Manchester, or Lumpkin? We know about Plains because Jimmy Carter was born and grew up there. After serving 4 years as President of the United States and winning a Nobel Peace Prize, Carter picked Plains, of all places, as the place he wanted to live after the White House. That's not normal for a modern-day ex-president. But Jimmy Carter was not a normal ex-president. So when it was announced in February of his 98th year, that he was entering home hospice care, I decided to go to Plains, of all places, to seek answers about who he was, from the people he talked with at the dinner table, or who attended his Sunday school classes, or who hammered nails beside him building a house. Because Jimmy Carter was more than Plains' main man. His life stands as a lesson and as a challenge for people who would like to leave a better world than the one they were born into.
How many people who acquired great wealth and decide they're going to go out and plant gardens for hungry people? I mean, you don't see that. Usually they keep dabbling in some way in ways on how they can make more money.
That's the Reverend William Howard, who grew up in Americus just 10 miles from Plains. Now a retired Baptist pastor in New Jersey, he was 33 years old when he met Carter for the first time at the White House. Howard was then president of the National Council of Churches and had just returned from Iran, where he was one of 4 members of a clergy delegation invited by that country's Revolutionary Council in 1979 to visit the American hostages being held in the U.S. Embassy.
It's not a controversial position to say that Jimmy Carter devoted his life to service after he was president. You know, he wrote books. I'm sure he made some money on the books, but heck, he might have given it all away.
Bren Dubé used to meet with Carter in her role as director of Koinonia Farm, a small Christian community just outside Plains.
Mrs. Carter was working at the local food pantry, Harvest of Hope, and one of our members was there. We go weekly to help out there. And they were chatting, Mrs. Carter and our member. And our member said, my parents just moved in next door to you. And so you have next door neighbors. And Mrs. Carter said, well, what's their name? And she wrote it down. And then Elizabeth went to visit her parents maybe a day or so later, not long after. And they were so excited. President and Mrs. Carter had come to visit them and to welcome to the neighborhood.
Clara Chenault's mobile home is just a couple of 100 yards from the Carter's house in Plains and across the street from the Boys and Girls Club where she used to feed and take care of local children after school.
Well, yeah, this is like a lot of people say they know him. You don't know him, you know of him. Mm-hmm. You don't really know him. Mm-hmm. But the man that I came across years and years ago, I would think that this town would just keep up the traditional, what he led here, mm-hmm. what he brought here, as far as the kids, keeping the kids together. He brought a place for that. And the swimming pool, as far as getting them a swimming pool and everybody else, you know, when we did have a swimming pool. And he wanted to be equal for everybody, not just one person. I would like to see that legacy keep going.
Retired public school administrator Bobby Fuse remembered nervously meeting Carter as a boy when he was with the assistant pastor of Black Friendship Baptist Church at what would then have been a rare interracial gathering at an all-white First Baptist in Americus to prepare for a 1966 Billy Graham crusade that Carter helped organize. You'll only hear his voice because the Zoom video cut out.
Reverend Smith sat on the front row with me and my mother, and Jimmy Carter sat on a piano stool right in front of us. Well, as the program went on, every time somebody mentioned a Bible verse, Reverend Smith was able to enunciate it without looking at it, no matter what the person said. And at some point, Mr. Carter reached over to me and asked me, who is the gentleman sitting next to you? I've been watching him. I told him it was Reverend Smith. And he didn't say anything. I just thought he wanted to know who it was. And when benediction time came, I was very proud. I was so proud when Mr. Carter said, now we'll have benediction, and we'll have Reverend Elijah Smith, Friendship Baptist Church. Well, you know, everybody looking around now and saying, oh my, you know, how did he get on program? And when Reverend Smith got to the podium, he prayed the same way that he prayed when he'd be at my church. And I'll never forget that experience that talks about letting your light shine.
President Carter has, you know, when he puts his name on something and he calls somebody and says, I'd really like to see this happen. It usually happens.
The Carters announced in the early 2000s that they were going to be buried here in Plains. Typically, for at least modern day presidents, they're buried at their libraries. So, you know, that's in Atlanta. But President Carter,
a going concern.
Yeah, he didn't think Atlanta needed any tourism or economic development help. But he knows Plains will always need a little bit of.
What really sets Carter apart, however, is not where he was at the end of his life. It's how and why he got there.
At the end of a long campaign, I believe I know our people of this state as well as anyone could. Based on this knowledge of Georgians, North and South, rural and urban, liberal and conservative, I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
What made him reject the social mores of the pre-civil rights era South he grew up in? Some of the influences are clear. They have to do with the fact that in his time, within socially stratified Plains and its environs, bubbled a mix of factors that yielded a small group of people with whom Carter fit right in. This video focuses on two influences that emerged from the interviews I did by phone, on Zoom, and in person in Plains. The first was the social environment in which Carter grew up on his family's farm in the tiny community of Archery, just outside Plains. And the second was the religious environment that he was immersed in. On one level, both of these environments were similar to the conservative social and religious environments of the larger South. They were racist. But in Carter's case, there were aberrations from the norm in both environments, which he and others noted, and which one can reasonably infer played unique roles in his evolution as a politician and as a person. First, to the family farm. Before European settlement, most of the southeastern United States was inhabited by one of 5 major Native American nations. Their economies were based on agriculture, and that meant they tended to settle in towns, live in fixed dwellings with systems of property inheritance, That's unlike the nomadic bands of indigenous people on the Great Plains who were hunters and followed the migration of game animals like bison. Because they shared these cultural similarities with Europeans who began settling in the region, and because many of these Native Americans began to adopt aspects of the white culture, which included chattel slavery, white Americans referred to the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations as the 5 civilized tribes. Nevertheless, as the population of white settlers grew and their demands for more land were incorporated into state and federal government policies, these tribes, including those that lived in the Plains area, the Creeks, sometimes called the Muskogee, were forcibly removed to Oklahoma in the early 19th century. The Carter Farm is here in Archery, a small settlement 2 miles west of Plains. One of the legacies of Southern slavery is the so-called Black Belt of majority black counties through the region, where agriculture was heavily dependent on slave labor. The Black Belt is where Archery, which had 2 white families and 27 black families, is located. The people Jimmy Carter worked with on the farm were black. The kids he played with were mostly black. He grew up as a minority in his own community, albeit as a minority in control. His segregationist father, Earl Carter, was the boss. For some reason, however, it was control Jimmy Carter seemed okay relinquishing later in life, which was not normal in the South. Evan Kutzler, history professor at Georgia Southwestern State University in Americus, shared many Sunday evening meals with Carter when he roomed in Plains.
You know, the fact that Carter can grow from being, right, the son of Earl Carter, right, to being, you know, his own, you know, a global humanitarian leader does say something kind of profound about the, you know, about his own ability to change, but also kind of the human capacity to reflect and to grow over time. I do think there's part of the value in appreciating the post-presidency is seeing where he came from. He was never Lester Maddox, right? He was never a rabid segregationist, but he came from a place that made it very difficult for one to be, you know, for a son of a white, prominent political, you know, local political noteworthy and a farmer, a successful farmer, to be anything too far removed from that.
Sam Mahone, active in the civil rights movement in Americus, growing up there in the 1950s and 60s, a time that overlapped Carter's first political office as a county school board member, only discovered in recent years that his grandfather worked on the Carter Farm.
I had no relationship with Jimmy Carter during the time that the movement was going on. There were no alliances that came about from the Carter family or others during that period. There was a period when he was head of the school board there, and I know that tensions were very high during the time of school integration.
But years later, when Carter ran for Georgia governor and then president, Mahone became a Carter supporter, and the local civil rights history nonprofit that Mahone heads has honored the former president with its highest award.
This is what I learned from others in the community in terms of how there was this relationship with him when, as a kid, that he was pretty much a lot of his upbringing was under the umbrella of African Americans who lived in Archery, who took care of him, who watched over him when his parents had to leave town and what have you. So he had a close relationship with African Americans, and I think they had to do that later on played a great part in his later years in life, in the way that he could see those differences and was able to, at some point, when he felt pretty secure in his own position, that he began to sort of go against the grain in terms of what traditionally had been the white position in Sumter County. But it was a good while before that came about.
Carter's recorded voice plays for visitors to the farm today, which is part of the Jimmy Carter National Historical Park, managed by the National Park Service. Here's what Carter says when you enter this tenant farmer's house.
In addition to my mother and father, there were a few people that shaped my life. Two of them were Jack and Rachel Clark, who lived in this house. When my mother and father would go off on vacation, I would stay with Jack and Rachel, and they provided me with information about the basic rudiments of life, the priorities that any human being should accrue, and also my entree into understanding how the sharecroppers and day laborers lived in a strictly segregated society.
Carter used to sleep on the Clark's floor when his parents were out of town, and he obviously held Rachel Clark in especially high esteem.
Sometimes she'd smile at me and mention fish. Then she and I would leave the farm and walk 6 miles or so to reach a stream she knew. These journeys gave us ample time to talk, or rather, I would listen to her words, and she would think a while and then hold forth about God's holy way, how when we deal with nature, we are stewards of the earth. She'd say that blessings bring on debts to pay, describe the duties of a man and wife, and say the brave and strongest need not fight. She'd tell how praying gave her life a lift, and how it made her act and not just talk, like staying up all night with someone sick. It wasn't empty preaching like in church. Sometimes I wasn't glad to reach the creek. In later years, I'd visit Rachel's home in public housing. Sometimes I'd find her on the village street, then still a queen, her apron sagging with a can of beer. She'd laugh about what good times there had been, and tell me what she thought I ought to do in Washington, where I was working then.
Just as Carter's boyhood farm experiences led him to a different perspective from his contemporaries on the social order, so did religion. As with farm life, however, Carter's response to religious influences differed from most of those around him, who grew up in the same white Christian culture that he did. After his presidency, he rejected the racial segregation and white supremacy at Plains Baptist Church, where he grew up, for newly formed Maranatha Baptist Church just outside town. Later, he left the Southern Baptist Convention, founded before the Civil War to advocate for slavery, and now the nation's largest Protestant Christian denomination, because of its position on women's status and roles. Again, Carter encountered local exceptions to the religious culture that, unlike most of the white community, he did not dismiss. One was Clarence Jordan of Koinonia Farm, whom he met when he moved back to Plains to take over the family farm after his father's death in 1953. Jordan earned a degree in agriculture from the University of Georgia in 1933 and was also an ordained Southern Baptist minister with 2 seminary degrees. He was convinced the causes of Southwest Georgia's extreme poverty were as much spiritual as economic, and he believed the way to change society was to offer an alternative, in this case by creating a peaceful interracial community sharing ownership of farmland. In 1942, Jordan founded 440-acre Koinonia Farm near Plains with his wife and another Baptist couple. Though it has never had more than about 20 members, Koinonia is still an ongoing farm community today. It was not created to be a monastic or cloistered community, but as a missionary project in an area Jordan had grown up in and believed needed spiritual and economic renewal.
he was really smart. He had all this scientific knowledge, and then he had all the scriptural knowledge, and he was charismatic, and he was funny. I mean, he was a wonderful combination of a human being. But there was this idea of a demonstration plot, which is really an agricultural term, where you experiment with crops, and then people come and watch how they're doing, or learn from the experiment. So he and the other founders thought of Koinonia as a demonstration plot for the kingdom of God.
The reaction of white Georgians, especially during the 1950s and 60s civil rights era, while Jimmy Carter was on the Sumter County School Board, was the opposite of what Jordan wanted.
Because the Koinonians, they were boycotted by the local white community. The Carters were the ones who sort of helped them out, and they needed supplies and what have you, things like that. And I think it was during that period, that transitional period, that Carter finally began to broaden his own perspective in terms of not only the local community in terms of the race relations, but the global community as well. I think that had a lot to do with his own development, his own growth in terms of looking beyond Sumter County.
I asked Dubé whether in her conversations with Carter, she felt Clarence Jordan's beliefs about Christian community found a particular connection with the former president.
I don't know. Well, it was obvious he had read Clarence's books. It was obvious that he was familiar with Koinonia and what we were doing, not only back when he was in the Navy, but even when I was having dinner with him. But I see in him, and I don't think I'm projecting at all, just a lot of the same values as Koinonia has, because he very much he went home to Plains. He didn't have to go home to Plains. And, you could see them out there taking their turn mowing their church lawn. He was really part of that community and did what he could to build it up.
Carter's relationship with Koinonia wasn't well known until he returned to Plains after his presidency. But it was overshadowed by the housing project that Koinonia launched on the impetus of one of its new members, Millard Fuller, an Alabama lawyer and self-made millionaire who gave up his wealth to join Koinonia and save his marriage. Fuller's idea was to build low-cost housing using volunteer labor and no-interest loans for materials. It was originally called partnership housing, and the project built its first house in 1969 in Americus. Since then, what we now know as Habitat for Humanity, with a large publicity boost from the Carter's participation in more than 30 annual Carter work projects, has helped house 46 million people in all 50 states and more than 70 other countries. William Howard, the Americus native who went to Iran during the hostage crisis, also knew Millard Fuller.
I knew Millard Fuller better than I knew Jimmy Carter.
Mm-hmm.
And he and I used to have a running debate about how they were going to foreign countries, West Africa and all of these places, building houses, when the housing stock in the Black community of Americus was horrific. And I would always get into and of course, Millard, he wasn't trying to discount what I was saying, but I would say that Jimmy Carter was very instrumental in changing that scene. So now you go to Americus, the housing stock is greatly improved because of Habitat.
Patricia Taft, a former Plains City Councilwoman and Mayor Pro Tem, left California for Plains, where she had nieces, to build and live in a Habitat for Humanity house.
They told me, Aunt Penny, if you come here, you'll get a job and a home. And at that time, houses in California, mind you, 40 years ago, was $650 for a house with no roof. And I had 4 children by myself, because I just went through a divorce. And finding decent housing was not an option. So the promise of a house and a job, I did my little research, on the weather patterns, and the Koinonia Partners were the ones at that time who were building houses, which is a predecessor of Millard Fuller at that time was with Koinonia Partners.
Carter's open embrace of religion as a political figure, however, long predated Habitat. It was a central feature of his 1976 presidential campaign. Carter's campaign manager, Hamilton Jordan, a younger cousin of Koinonia's Clarence Jordan, called religion Carter's weirdo factor. Georgia Southwestern political science professor Jason Berggren, a Baptist married to a Jew who attended many of the Sunday school classes Carter taught at Maranatha Baptist Church, says religion has always been a part of American politics. But Carter's use of religion in the 76 campaign came at a politically opportune time.
This is actually one of, I think, Jimmy Carter's legacies. After the Vietnam War, after the Watergate scandal, the resignation of a vice president and a president of the United States, I think there were a lot of Americans looking for something different, looking for someone who didn't, keep their morality separate, from their politics. And many of them were prepared for someone who did believe maybe a simple faith, and that they were unafraid with bringing that into the public sphere and showing that, it's not just for something on Sunday morning. It's something that you apply 7 days a week. And I think a lot of Americans found that very refreshing. And with his election, and some called it the year of the evangelical because he brought out so many people, to back his campaign. And oddly, people like Mike Pence and Michelle Bachmann were among those who got involved in politics because of Jimmy Carter, because he was a fellow evangelical, and they got, excited. I mean, Pat Robertson, same thing, had endorsed and supported, Jimmy Carter. And, when you win, right, that kind of spawns, I think, imitation. When you show people that, hey, there's a new way and a different way of being able to do this, I think other politicians picked up on that.
That interview, in which Berggren mentioned Pat Robertson, was in April. What struck me about Berggren's analysis was the parallel I saw between the violent rejection of Clarence Jordan's Koinonia model for society and the rejection of Carter's religiously inspired values of tolerance and inclusion by divisive religious figures like Robertson. I asked Bren Dubé of Koinonia about that a couple of days after my Berggren interview.
We believe all people, no matter what, are your brothers and your sisters. And so we sat down to eat with Black folk, and that was totally against the culture. That's when the bombing started, and the 300 fruit trees cut down and fences cut and sugar in gas tanks. The roadside stand was not bombed, not dynamited once, but twice. I mean, it was horrible. The Koinonia stayed, but did not fight fire with fire. So we got in trouble with that. Then when that didn't work, there was a boycott against Koinonia. No one would sell to us or buy from us, which just drove a farm to its very knees. Why is a little place like Koinonia so scary? I guess because I really can't explain it. I really don't know why we're a threat or scary to anybody.
But you are.
We are. We are.
Clarence Jordan he's been described as the best kind of troublemaker. John Lewis, this congressman from Alabama and civil rights leader, talked about Good Trouble. That's the name of the documentary film about him. What's the relationship to trouble and the kind of work that you do?
I think it's just because it's we're going to work for the poor. We're going to work for justice. We're going to work for all people. We're a family, you know.
And why is that not seen as a good thing?
Because greed. I don't know. A lot of that is taught. You're taught as a child that, you know. I was just reading this morning, Nelson Mandela, that you're not born seeing race and the differences in people. You are taught that. You're taught hate. And if you can be taught hate, you can be taught love. But a lot of it does come down to individualism, me, money, fear of, you know, if somebody might get what I want or need or think I need. I don't know why we're scary. Do I look scary? I'm not scary.
Carter and his toothy grin, parodied by this famous peanut sculpture in Plains, came across as anything but publicly threatening during his 4 years in Washington. Nevertheless, there were aspects of his presidency that threatened special interests that generated intense opposition. There's a monument to that in Plains, too. It's in this field owned by Carter just north of downtown. These solar panels generate electricity equal to about 60% of the power used in the town. In 1979, Carter ordered solar panels to be installed on the roof of the White House. It was part of his response to a 75% reduction in Iranian oil production and an ensuing rise in worldwide oil prices connected to political unrest in that country. The unrest also led to the taking of the American hostages held in the U.S. Embassy there. With those solar panels, Carter was trying to demonstrate that developing alternate energy technologies could free the nation and the world from its dependence on just one source of energy that was highly vulnerable to disruption, not to mention limited in supply. But just as Clarence Jordan's vision for Koinonia threatened an entrenched social structure based on white supremacy, renewable energy resources like wind and solar threaten some of the most entrenched economic interests on the planet, including in the United States, which in recent years has become the world's top oil producer. Carter was never able to successfully make the case to the American public that energy doesn't have to come exclusively from oil. His successor, Ronald Reagan, had the solar panels removed from the White House roof, though they were reinstalled under the first George Bush and Barack Obama. Carter's ultimate legacy, which he admitted chafed him, is that he was a much better ex-president, as demonstrated by his simple, principled life, which is widely held up as a model, than he was as a president, because he couldn't build enough public support to win a second term. The Reverend Buck Kinney, who says he has significant theological and political differences from his fellow Plains Boys and Girls Club board member, nevertheless professes an admiration for Carter that is widely shared across the political spectrum of southwestern Georgia.
So it requires someone who is in a position of authority and influence to be the one to say, we can't keep going the way we're going. And I need to be an agent for bringing people together and trying to help people see the commonality of being a human being and starting there, and then you continue from that. So without somebody like him, I'll just put it like that, without somebody like him who is really established to, really well dedicated to establishing peace, not pleasing other people, not serving themselves. And that's where we have a lot of problem with politicians. There's a lot of voices that are vying for their attention, and they're really concerned about a lot of them, a great number of them staying in office. And he didn't do that. There's no way you can look at what he did in his time in office and the things that he did after that and say that he was generally more concerned about himself and his own, agenda than he was everyone else. And it's going to take someone else like him and influence like that again, I think, to get us through this next hole that we're in right now.
This next hole that we're in right now, as Kenny and the others I interviewed describe the nation's current situation, is not something for which they blame their neighbor, the man who used to wave at them when he pedaled past on his bike or mowed the lawn at his church.
I can't put it in. It's not Carter. It's all of us. All of us, whites and blacks, have retreated from trying to live in a better country. We expel people out of state legislatures who talk about saving children's lives. That's where we are. And there's not any one politician. It's all of us as people of goodwill. We just have not done enough to continue to make the world a better place to live. We just don't do it. We're not concerned about climate change. We're not concerned about poor people. We're not concerned about children being shot in school. As individuals, we're not. Because if we were concerned about it, we'd be doing a lot more about it.